The wedding hall slowly emptied as the night moved forward, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier than the celebration itself, and Margaret stood near the tall window with her coat folded over her arm, watching soft snow fall outside onto the empty parking lot, her reflection faint in the glass, her heart full yet strangely hollow, because the day she had prepared for months had ended, and her daughter Emily was no longer just her daughter but a wife, stepping into a life that no longer revolved around her mother's careful guidance. And as Margaret listened to the fading echoes of laughter and music still ringing in her ears, memories rushed through her mind without warning. The first day Emily went to school holding her finger tightly, the late nights helping her study, the tears after her first heartbreak, and the pride she felt watching her walk down the aisle only hours earlier, radiant and confident, yet now the joy mixed with an ache she hadn't expected, not sadness exactly, but the quiet realization that a chapter had closed. And while she smiled politely at the last guests leaving and thanked the staff, inside she felt exposed, as if the role that defined her for decades had gently slipped away without asking permission, and she wondered if anyone noticed how hard it was for a mother to let go gracefully, because no one teaches you how to stand still after years of being needed every day. And as she took a deep breath, telling herself she had done well and should feel proud, the silence around her grew deeper, making the hall feel too large, too empty. And it was in that fragile moment, when the applause was gone and the lights were dimmed, that she heard footsteps approaching behind her, steady and deliberate. And before she could turn or prepare herself, a calm male voice spoke her name with unexpected care. "Margaret," it said, not rushed, not loud, and she turned to see Daniel, her daughter's husband, standing there in his dark suit, looking composed yet thoughtful, as if he had been searching for her. And the sight of him stirred something unfamiliar inside her, not attraction, not discomfort, but awareness, because he was no longer just a guest or a polite young man, he was now family, someone who carried her daughter's future in his hands, and she noticed his expression wasn't casual or celebratory, but serious in a gentle way, and as he asked if he could speak with her for a moment, Margaret felt a small tension rise in her chest, unsure of what a newly married man could possibly need from her at such a late hour, yet she nodded, trusting her instincts. And as they stood there together in the quiet hall surrounded by half-packed decorations and fading warmth, Margaret sensed that this conversation would mark the real end of the day, not with music or applause, but with words that would stay with her long after the wedding lights were turned off. Daniel looked at Margaret with a mixture of nervousness and sincerity as they sat at one of the last tables still set in the dimly lit hall, the white tablecloth slightly wrinkled and the leftover decorations giving the room a quiet, intimate feeling. And Margaret noticed for the first time how different he seemed now that he was not performing the polite duties of a wedding guest but speaking to her as a man who truly cared, and he began carefully, explaining that he wanted to talk about more than just pleasantries, that he had thought a lot about family and love and what it meant to be connected not only to Emily but to the people who raised her. And Margaret listened, curiosity mingled with a quiet apprehension, as Daniel admitted that when he first met Emily, he was drawn to her kindness, her intelligence, and her laughter, but he had also noticed the way she carried herself, the confidence and warmth that made her who she was, and he paused, choosing his words, before telling Margaret that much of what Emily had become, the generosity, the strength, the resilience, was a reflection of her upbringing, of the love and care Margaret had poured into her. And Margaret felt a pang in her chest, surprised by the honesty of his observation, touched that he recognized the effort she had put into raising her daughter. And Daniel's voice softened as he spoke directly to her, saying that he saw her dedication, her sacrifices, and the quiet moments where she had stayed strong even when no one was watching, and he wanted her to know that he appreciated it deeply, promising that he would honor Emily and protect her in the way Margaret had always hoped someone would. And as he spoke, Margaret felt tears threatening to spill, not from sadness but from a sudden wave of recognition, a feeling of being seen after years of putting her family first. And yet there was a tension in the room, a sense that he had more to say, a part of the conversation that would linger in her memory. And when he said, almost hesitantly, that there was one more thing he wanted to tell her, Margaret felt her pulse quicken, uncertain what could possibly follow. And Daniel's careful, sincere tone hinted that it was something meaningful, something that might change the way she saw this new chapter of her life, leaving her on the edge of anticipation as the snow outside reflected the pale light. casting a calm glow over the hall that felt suspended in time, holding them both in a quiet, emotional pause that promised an unforgettable revelation. Daniel took a deep breath, folding his hands together on the table as if to steady himself, and began speaking with a careful honesty that immediately caught Margaret's attention, explaining that what he was about to say was meant to be taken with respect and clarity, not as confusion or regret, and Margaret, sensing the sincerity in his voice, nodded, silently giving him permission to continue, and Daniel shared that during the wedding preparations he had watched Margaret closely, not in a way that was intrusive, but as someone noticing the depth of a person's character, and he admitted that he saw things many people overlooked, the way she smiled for others even when she was tired, the strength she displayed quietly, the love she carried for her family and the way she moved through life with grace despite challenges, and he paused, letting her absorb the words, because he wanted her to understand he wasn't speaking casually, but from a place of real observation and admiration, and then, with a tone both gentle and firm, he acknowledged that he recognized something deeper in her. Something that often goes unnoticed in the busyness of raising a family, and he described it as a kind of quiet loneliness, not as a flaw, but as a layer of her humanity that made her remarkable. And Margaret felt her breath catch because he wasn't overstepping any boundaries, he wasn't being romantic, but his words carried weight, as if he were shining a light on her heart in a way she hadn't experienced in years, and Daniel continued, emphasizing that his admiration came from respect and care. From understanding the woman who had shaped Emily into the person he loved, and he wanted Margaret to know that she was seen, truly seen, and that the effort, the love, and the strength she had given to her family were appreciated and honored by someone who would now be part of her life permanently. And as he spoke, Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mix of relief, pride, and unexpected comfort. Because it wasn't just praise, it was acknowledgement of a lifetime of quiet sacrifices, of nights spent worrying and days spent giving, and Daniel's words, measured and heartfelt, created a space where she could feel recognized without guilt, without expectation, just human connection, and the moment hung in the air like a delicate thread, charged with emotion, leaving Margaret aware that this conversation, unexpected and gentle, would stay with her far longer than the wedding itself, as it honored the complexity of her life and her role in shaping the woman her daughter had become, making her feel valued, respected, and deeply understood in a way few ever had, and yet, despite the tenderness, there was still a soft tension, an unspoken question lingering in her mind about what else he might say, keeping her heart and thoughts suspended in anticipation as the hall around them grew quieter, the lights dimmer, and the world outside continued its winter hush, holding them in this brief, profound pause that promised a memory she would carry forever. Margaret felt a wave of relief and warmth wash over her as she listened to Daniel's words, realizing that the sincerity in his voice was not just empty flattery but a heartfelt acknowledgement of her life and the love she had given, and she smiled through the tears that had formed, quietly admitting to herself that she had not expected to feel so seen on a day that had been entirely about her daughter, and as she straightened her shoulders, she spoke softly, expressing her gratitude for his honesty and care, telling him that his words had brought her peace and reminded her that love never truly leaves, it only changes its form, and Daniel nodded, his eyes reflecting the same quiet emotion, showing that he understood exactly what she meant, and for a moment, they shared a connection that was deeply human, grounded in respect, appreciation, and the recognition of all the unseen sacrifices and the strength that Margaret had poured into raising Emily. And then Margaret reached out with a gentle, reassuring touch on his arm, not lingering inappropriately, just offering warmth and human comfort, acknowledging the bond that had formed between them that day, and she told him that he had given her a gift greater than any material present, the gift of being truly recognized and valued. And just as Emily's laughter rang from the hallway calling for her husband, reminding them both that life was moving forward and responsibilities and joy awaited them beyond the quiet hall, Daniel stood with a soft smile, assuring Margaret that every word he had said was genuine and meant to honor her and the love she had nurtured. And as he walked toward the door to rejoin his new wife, Margaret watched him go with a heart full of gratitude and understanding, realizing that this brief, unexpected conversation had transformed her evening from a simple reflection on endings to a profound acknowledgement of continuity, love, and connection. And later that night, sitting alone in her car with the gentle snow still falling outside, Margaret thought about the wedding, about Daniel's careful words, about Emily's happiness, and she understood something she hadn't realized before. Even after giving so much of herself to others, she was still worthy of being seen, appreciated, and respected. And that realization brought her a deep sense of contentment, a peaceful joy that filled the quiet spaces in her heart, and she knew that the memory of this conversation, the gentle honesty and respect that Daniel had shown, would stay with her forever. Not because it was dramatic or romantic in a conventional sense, but because it was real, tender, and human, a moment that reminded her that love, in all its forms, had a way of reaching beyond expectations and leaving an imprint on the soul that nothing could erase. And as she finally started the engine and drove into the softly lit streets of the quiet town, Margaret felt lighter, knowing that today had not just been a wedding, but a turning point, a moment of recognition and connection she would carry in her heart for the rest of her life.